introducing today's presenter and moderator. Our speaker today is Dr. Arnico Panday, who happened to be the moderator for last month's talk as well. Dr. Panday is an atmospheric scientist by training and has held many research positions in this area in Nepal and abroad. He has served in a variety of advisory roles for the government of Nepal, the United Nations, and other major international organizations, and is currently a senior advisor to the National Planning Commission of Nepal. He's also the CEO of Ullens Education Foundation, leading its effort to establish Nepal's first liberal arts college in Nala. He's also an IIDS senior fellow. Arnico did his graduate work at MIT, where he wrote his PhD dissertation on air pollution in the Kathmandu Valley. The moderator today will be Aarjan Dixit, who I'm happy to say has been an old friend of mine since our school days together. Aarjan is an expert on the impact of climate change on developing societies and has more than 10 years of experience in research and advising in this field. He's currently based in Singapore as an independent consultant for the World Resources Institute. And prior to that, he was the Climate Change and Resilience Senior Advisor to CARE International for the Asia Pacific region, first based in Phnom Penh and subsequently in Manila. He did his graduate work at the Yale School of Forestry and worked in Washington, D.C. for several years before moving to Asia. Before Dr. Panday starts, let me remind our participants of the ground rules. Please remember to keep your mics muted unless you're invited to speak. Arnico will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have a few minutes of commentary from Aarjan, followed by the Q&A session. We'll try to end promptly at 7 p.m. Nepal time, but we may go a few minutes over as we usually do. You're always welcome to send in your questions via chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom. As always, we're grateful to the IIDS staff for supporting this series. Okay, Arnico, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good evening, everyone. You listed out my different affiliations. A quick disclaimer, the presentation today is all my own opinion, does not reflect any of the organizations I'm associated with. I'll be deliberately provocative with my presentation. So I'll start sharing the screen. Does that work? So I'm not an expert on infrastructure. I'm a climate scientist, but I would like to push myself and everyone in the room to reflect a bit about what makes sense for Nepal in the long run, etc. So, I mean, building infrastructure in Nepal is very hard work. If you look in the upper left corner, you see a construction machine at work. This was on the Beni Jomsam Road around 2012 or so. If we're gonna work this hard, can we try to do it right? So I called the talk today, are we traveling straight while the road ahead curves? I feel like a number of times we stick to plans made decades ago that might no longer be relevant and might no longer be the best solution as we move forward. I would like to acknowledge the two interns at IIDS, Anisha Dongul and Priyanka Gurung, who have been working very hard in helping me pull together material for this talk and giving me a lot of feedback on how to move forward with it. So I will start off with a brief warning from elsewhere about a canceled airport project in Mexico City. Then go into the Melamchi floods from June, try to understand what happened. Talk about climate change and what we'll face in the near future, and what it would mean for climate change to be contained. How will the world change and the implications for us? For example, will Nijgadh airport actually still be viable? To what question is Burhi Gandaki hydropower the answer? And how do we build resilient infrastructure networks that serve everyone? I will not be able to go into great detail on all of these topics, but I'll try to kind of pull a narrative through all of them. So let's start with an example from Mexico City, another capital city in a bowl-shaped valley, kind of similar location to Kathmandu, but quite a bit bigger, whose airport reached severe congestion already in 2002. And finally, in 2014, a decision was made to relocate from the airport surrounded by city the nearby former lake bed of Lake Texcoco. An international firm, Foster and Partners, which is famous for building big airports in China, was hired. They came up with a spectacular looking design for an airport that would accommodate 66 million passengers a year. Total cost was going to be $13 billion, the largest public infrastructure project in Mexico in a century, but partially government funded, partially through various loans. By 2018, the incoming president called a referendum that led to cancellation of the project, even though 30% had already been completed. $3 billion had been spent by the government, and there was going to be a lot more costs of canceling the project. And what the exact cost of cancellation is still disputed. Even recently, there were disputes about how many $1 billion the cancellation itself will still cost. Instead, a new project was started, which was partly to improve the existing airport, and the other is to take an existing airbase in Santa Lucia, which is actually further away than this, and turn that into a new airport, with the total cost for both projects being about $4 billion. Meanwhile, delays in getting sufficient airport capacity will cost the economy several $1 billion a year also. So there's a lot of lessons here. A lot of money was wasted on Texcoco before the project was canceled. If people had gone straight into the alternative solution, it would have been cheaper, but it's also very expensive to change direction late. So let's come back to Nepal. What happened in the Melamchi floods? On June 16, the Melamchi River suddenly rose up into town and swept through with this dark, muddy mess. Raised the river bed with sediment spread, and then the river spread out. A lot of houses were buried up to the second floor. Bridges were washed out, roads were destroyed, fields were covered in rubble. A number of lives were lost. Meanwhile, Melamchi drinking water project a bit higher up. It was only completed in April 2021 with a 28-kilometer tunnel bringing drinking water from Melamchi River to Kathmandu. This is looking upstream at the diversion dam, which would send water into the side, part of the excess water coming out here again, but the tunnel inlet is somewhere over here. In the June 16 flood buried the inlet under 9 meters of rubble. You can see that this tower here, over here, much of the dam is gone. These buildings are still a bit visible. A second flood in July added 5 more meters of rubble, and then this is all that's left now of this building down here. So the damage is several billion rupees. I think the exact estimates are still being made, but it's not just a matter of digging out and restoring what was here. How do you protect it from this happening again? And that's not really fully understood yet. So what happened? In March, April, we had an extremely dry spring. We had lots of forest fire, really awful air quality that probably that caught a lot of attention. But then suddenly in May, 2 cyclones, one in the Bay of Bengal, one in the Arabian Sea, dumped so much water on us that we actually had more rainfall for the entire spring season than average. And they also dumped really unseasonably heavy snow in the upper areas of the Melamchi watershed. In June, the monsoon kind of started with a bang with unusually heavy rain. And where just a couple of weeks before a lot of snow had been dumped, we got rain now onto snow, which led to an unusually large amount of liquid water at high altitudes. The same thing didn't just happen in Upper Melamchi, but also in Manang and in Northern Gorkha. And so a small study from ISIMO talks about cascading hazards coming down the valley, with several things happening, with landslides along the way, etc. I'll focus on one place called Brematang because it has some lessons for us. So Brematang is a place I only heard about after this flood. What is there is there was a landslide several centuries ago that dammed the Melamchi River, and behind it, gradually a lake filled up with sediments, forming a grass and shrub covered plateau. If you look at the front end here, this is where the landslide came down and had blocked off, turned this whole area into a lake that then filled up with sediments. On June 16, the heavy floods from the snow melt higher up brought a lot of debris onto the plateau, basically covered the whole thing in rubble from higher up, and created a congestion at the front, which then led to the front edge starting to erode away. This is now the front edge of the Brematang Plateau, and you see this whole gash of sediments missing from where the landslide dam had sat before. And so it's sediments from here that were carried down the valley, and then along the way there was what is called toe cutting as the river digs deeper, creating additional landslides which provided more sediments. The scary thing is now every time it rains, Brematang will send more sediments down the valley, sediments that have been sitting stably for hundreds of years. And there is no evidence that ADB, which financed the Melamchi drinking water project, ever considered the risk of these sediments coming down and clogging up the whole intake area. There's a YouTube video that really impressively shows a helicopter flight up this way. I'll show it at the end if there's time, but let me move on for now. But where else in Nepal might we have similar situations? Take Phoksondo Lake. If you look at the geology of it, clearly there was a landslide that came down, the whole mountain crashed down, dammed up the river, and which created the lake. There's similar to Brematang, there is like a river cascading down the front end of the old landslide. Now, what happens if somehow part of this landslide dam starts failing? Maybe you get a landslide into the lake that creates a big wave or unusually heavy landslide. You'll end up having the whole lake draining down the Peri River. So what are we facing in the near future with climate change? Right now, global average temperatures are somewhere around 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial. And even the goal of limiting global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial will still mean a 1.8 to 2.2 degree warming in the Himalayas. And so even in the best case scenario, we're going to lose 1/3 of our glaciers by the end of the century. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change now has really clear fingerprints of climate change as being the cause of extreme weather events that have been seen around the world, the spring, the summer, and before. For example, the flooding in Soda. And what it really raises the question is whether our infrastructure has been designed to withstand the violent weather extremes that we're facing. Here's pictures from various places around Nepal, from the media. From Manang, we see the bridge that's half underwater, several other bridges that are being damaged, both in the hills and in Tarai, and in the lower right is Gordikola Hydropower, which also does not seem to have been built to withstand the climate extremes we're now facing. And it raises question about even the under construction infrastructure. Is it really built to withstand our climate extremes? Here's a picture from a couple of days ago from Pokhara's new international airport. And you see what's happening with the water that's being diverted off the runway to the end, and it's cascading down into Bijaypur Khola, obviously eroding away the edges here, pretty close to the end of the runway. If we're going to get more rainfall, we better manage the water in much better ways than what we're doing so far. Climate change is not going to stop at 1.1 degrees. We'll get to 1.5 or possibly much worse. So extreme weather events will increase in both size and frequency, more droughts, worse forest fires, more flash floods and landslides, more inundations in the Tarai. Here's a picture from Anil Pokhrel from north of Manaslu, northern Gorkha, where you see a landslide coming down, burying a lot of the fields. There's also, we're going to see more hurricanes and cyclones. They need seawater temperatures above 26 degrees Celsius to form. And with climate change, larger parts of the ocean for more of the year will have seawater temperatures at that temperature. We'll have less water stored in glaciers. So initially, there might be an increase in the river as the glaciers melt away, and then a decrease in dry season water flow, which impacts our hydropower, agriculture, drinking water. And when glaciers retreat, they leave fragile glacial lakes that grow in the hollow that left behind, with increased risk in floods when the lakes burst out. For example, here is Tulagi Lake in north of Manaslu. You see how it's been growing. If this lake bursts out and it floods down the Marsiangdi Valley, it will really affect the hydropower projects there. So we face increased risks of disruption to our transport networks, even to telecom and electricity networks. So how will the world change as we move forward towards actually doing something about climate change? The only way to really address climate change is to rid the world of the use of fossil fuels. The biggest cause of rising temperatures globally is the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. much of it due to burning of fossil fuels, which basically is a transfer of carbon stored underground from the time of dinosaurs into the atmosphere really rapidly, and then it leads to warming of the atmosphere. There's also a contribution from deforestation, transfer of carbon that was stored in above ground biomass when people cut down the trees and transfer that carbon into the atmosphere. Some contribution from black carbon, methane, ozone, air pollutants that are shorter lived in the atmosphere. Although the big one in the room still is carbon dioxide. So reforesting, removing some SLCPs will make a dent, but we have no choice but globally but to cut down on emissions of carbon dioxide, which means stopping the use of petroleum products, coal, natural gas. And we don't have a lot of time to do that before global average temperatures reach 1.5 degrees. You see the global average temperature increase, and probably by within another 2 decades, if not sooner, we'll reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So the later we get serious about doing something, the steeper our cuts in emissions will need to be. This is where we are now with COVID. What scenario are we going to follow? The longer we wait, the quicker we'll have to drop emissions of carbon dioxide. So the Glasgow COP that's starting in a month seeks commitments from countries to reach net zero by 2050, which is not enough to, in many scenarios, is not enough to contain climate change unless people cut it down much, much sooner, before 2040, as you see in the graph here. So these shifts away from fossil fuels will happen. Whether they're sufficient to stabilize climate at 1.5 degrees or at 2 degrees, we don't know yet. But we'll still, very rapidly, we're shifting road travel to electric. It's already happening in Nepal and elsewhere. There is ways of producing clean electricity without fossil fuels. Electricity production is will have to shift away from coal and gas. There's already commitments to not build new coal-fired power plants from a lot of countries that are continuing to signing up for that, phasing out coal and gas from electricity production. Solar power and battery have been and will keep getting cheaper. Also, probably a less demand for business travel, as we've come to learn through COVID now that a lot of meetings can be run successfully virtually without having to travel to sites. Air travel is a tricky one because it doesn't have any easy, clean solutions. Batteries are very heavy compared to fuel, and they don't lose weight as they get used up, unlike fuel. A typical trans-Pacific flight takes off with almost half of its weight in air fuel, and as it burns up, the plane gets lighter, which allows it to fly further. Battery-powered airplanes, except for small half-hour flights and four-seaters, are not anywhere viable in the coming decades. Already in Europe, there's a flight shaming movement and a shift to rail travel, and the BBC article that goes into the details of that you should read when you get a chance. Perhaps after COVID, air travel might briefly rebound, but for climate reasons, it will have to get more expensive and rarer. This might have impacted tourism in Nepal. Are we really going to get the millions of tourists that we want? Perhaps what the shift will be to fewer quick hops up to Nepal. People from Dubai coming for a weekend will get less. Maybe we'll be able to get more neighbors coming by road or by rail. Maybe fewer tourists, but how do we get them to stay longer? So the question then is Nijgadh Airport going to be viable? What is Nijgadh Airport? Already since the 1980s, there was a search for a site for a second international airport, as it was clear that Tribhuvan Airport in Kathmandu was going to reach its limits soon. Sorry, there's a typo here. By the 2018 projections were that it would reach its capacity by 2028. Apologies about the typo. That's even adding a new terminal and taxiway. So by pre-COVID predictions, we only had a decade to find an alternative for it. 1995 pre-feasibility identified Nijgadh as the best site. I think they evaluated about 10 sites around Nepal. Nijgadh is about 60 kilometers south of Kathmandu, and it was envisioned to be an airport by an airport city. Just checking that the connection works okay. I had a quick internet outage. So, Vinisha, is it okay?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is the previous slide. I'm not sure how long the outage was, describing what the Nijgadh Airport project was. So a very large amount of land was allocated for the project. The red line across is the East-West Highway. Starting in 2019, already 600 million rupees, so about $5 million, $6 million has been spent on fencing as well as on land acquisition, compensation to local communities that have to move out. A large part is forest, but not all of it. And phase one of the project envisions an initial one runway and a terminal with a capacity of about 15 million passengers a year. The link to Kathmandu would be the 76-kilometer fast track highway that's under construction now, but still a long way from being complete. The ultimate size of the airport, 60 million passengers, is not just to serve Nepal, but to be an aviation transit hub. And before COVID, there was a strong interest by an international investor to build the airport, Zurich Airports, which now seems to have pulled out. So there's some common objections to the airport. The most vocal one seems to be from people who care about the need to cut hundreds of thousands of trees. There's of course an attraction to the government. Cutting trees generates royalties, but then here's a part of is an older picture from about 20 years ago, showing the area. There's concerns about biodiversity losses, but also about corruption and about whether there's a stronger motivation to cut the trees, or whether the viability of the airport project is being considered. The project itself does not have a DPR detailed project report yet. And so the environmental impact assessment report is controversial because it was done without the DPR. So how accurate is it? And the question of whether Nijgadh would still be viable as a hub. Hub airports generally, such as Doha, Dubai, Delhi, Bangkok before COVID, they connect a lot of people from a lot of cities to a lot of other cities by having short transit times and options to catch a lot of other flights. In a landlocked country, we have higher fuel costs, so perhaps Nijgadh will not be able to compete for Europe to Australia traffic, but we're strategically located between India and China. Could we imagine that Nijgadh be a hub connecting Nepal, passengers from India to China? Someone from Nagpur wanted to go to Xi'an, a one-stop connection in Nijgadh, instead of having a 2 or 3 stop way to get there. Looks promising, but then the problem is the Tibetan Plateau for connection to China. Generally, as you know, when you're flying in the airplane, the announcements about oxygen masks falling if there's depressurization, they only have oxygen for a 10-minute flight, during which the plane should descend to 10,000 feet. Well, the Tibetan Plateau has an average altitude of 15,000 feet. So you end up with most airplanes avoiding flying over the Tibetan Plateau altogether. Only a few specially equipped aircraft that fly to Lhasa or Lhasa Kathmandu, Lhasa Chengdu, etc., fly over the Tibetan Plateau. So flights going from Kathmandu to Beijing to Seoul to Tokyo, even now, they fly south to Dhaka first before heading east. And so actually that would make Nijgadh not really be able to compete with Kolkata or Dhaka or Guwahati being as a central plane position to connect India to China. Here's a quick flight radar shot of the most recent flight coming from between Kathmandu and Tokyo, and you see how it had to go pretty far south to avoid the whole mountain area of the Tibetan Plateau. Also, a lot of experiences elsewhere of building second airports far away have really mixed results. In Montreal, the new airport shut down again and people moved back to the old airport. In Milan, all the airlines are fighting over staying at the old airport. In Taipei, the news, most people prefer the old Songshan airport right in the city, similar to Kathmandu airport, rather than taking a train or driving almost an hour to Taiyuan airport down in the plains. In Washington, people pay twice as much to fly from the airport near the city compared to the further away Dulles Airport. Even in Tokyo, as soon as Haneda Airport expanded capacity, added more runways, airlines were fighting to move back there again with their long haul flights, leaving the further away Narita airport to low-cost airlines. Bangkok has a bit of an exception, but the new and the old airport are both the same distance from the city. There's some places where the newer airports work, but only where there was fast trains to the city, and the old airport was actually shut down. Examples are Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. So how do you make Nijgadh viable with just a 4-lane highway that will still have traffic jams on the entry and exit points to Kathmandu? But is global aviation even going to continue to make Nijgadh viable? The whole business case for Nijgadh assumes that aviation will continue to grow indefinitely the way it has before COVID. And that way, Kathmandu will run out of space by 2028. In COVID, we saw that entire countries' fleets could be parked overnight. Globally, aviation numbers are not expected to reach pre-COVID levels until 24 or 25, but will they? What if awareness of the need to stop climate change keeps growing? And from Europe, there's a lot of indications, the flight chain movement from Sweden, the UK free flight movement, a lot of people committing to traveling less by flight, more by plane, additional taxes being imposed. What if air travel gets much more expensive, much more rare? Are we just going to have an empty airport that's not generating the revenue to pay back its cost? And on to another major infrastructure project, Burhi Gandaki Hydropower. As you know, most of our hydropower plants are run at the river, so they don't store water, they just generate electricity as the water flows through. And we do have a need for more peak power. Kulekhani, which is our only peaking power plant with a reservoir, is not enough. So Burhi Gandaki project proposes a 263-meter tall dam generating up to 1,200 megawatts of hydropower, and behind the dam creating a 45-kilometer long lake that would inundate the homes of about 50,000 people, submerge 3.5 million trees, etc. The government has already spent almost a third of $1 billion on land acquisition, and is just allocated another $200 million on buying up houses and sheds. But locals are very unhappy with the compensation amount. There's a lot of media reports on this. There's also been a lot of history back and forth about who will build the project, a lot of delays. The Chinese contractor currently that was awarded the project, I think in 2018, has been out of touch and really not showing much interest in moving forward with it. Is it time to rethink? So is Burhi Gandaki the best use of the money of almost $3 billion? We start from thinking about how electricity is produced in hydropower. You're dropping water down through a turbine. You're converting the potential energy of water that's sitting up high into kinetic energy of falling water, then into electric energy. It's a 140-year-old battery technology of using and storing energy in high water. So Burhi Gandaki works by storing water and then releasing it. Problems are part of it is storing up monsoon water, so there's evaporation loss over the months. Uncertainties of how climate change will affect water in the river, but also sediment accumulation behind the dam. And so our battery capacity actually will decrease over time as the reservoir fills with sediment. And approximately a quarter of the reservoir capacity is allocated for this, but this might fill up much faster than what is expected. It's expensive. The 2015 estimates were $2.5 billion. It will be far over $3 billion. Estimates are that the cost might go way over that. So we should ask, is it the best solution to our problem? Prices of solar and battery technology are dropping. In Rajasthan, solar power cost 19 cents per unit in 2010, but it's now 3.7 cents, no longer competitive with Nepali hydropower, which is around 7 cents per unit. And in Chile, already several hydropower projects have been canceled in favor of solar power. My intern, Anisha, will be able to give more details on that during discussion if you'd like to hear more. So have we adequately considered alternatives? For example, solar. The currently largest solar power project in Nepal, the proposed 250 megawatt project in Baki in Kopilvastu, is only $190 million. So generating the same amount of solar power as Burhi Gandaki would generate hydropower would be less than $1 billion. And cost of solar panels keep dropping, and it's much faster to install these. There's also a question, do we actually need to generate additional electricity to have peak power? Do we just need to store it? Even now, with Tamakosi working, we're wasting a lot of electricity. This is from today's online cover. Wasting 70 million rupees per day of electricity because no one's using it, and India is not buying it from us. Are we better off just storing that in batteries? So Tesla Megapack batteries are about $1 million per Megapack, which stores about 3 million megawatt hours. So if we want 1,200 megawatts for 3 hours a day from Buri Gandaki, that would require about 1,200 of these, $1.2 billion. And even if we want to add excess capacity and not run the batteries down to zero all the time, we're still talking something that is significantly cheaper than Buri Gandaki. And of course, these batteries, they can be dispersed around the country, closer to hydropower producers, closer to consumers. Maybe existing hydropower plus some solar would storing up electricity that's otherwise being wasted in the middle of the night or during lower use times. Would that be sufficient to charge up enough batteries to give the same results as Buri Gandaki, or cheaper, quicker, and more flexible? There's also, of course, the question of building what will probably be the world's 10th largest, highest dam in a seismically fragile location. What if the dam fails? The DPR shows that below the dam, you'll have a 150-meter tall surge wave, which would still be 20 meters tall by the time it reaches the border with India. So imagine what happens to places along the way, including Nijgadh and other towns, if this dam were to fail. So we think a bit more about what kind of infrastructure we would need in the coming decades. One of the things is that we need to think about what are our weak points in our network. One example, I was involved in the airport in organizing relief flights after the earthquake. And we were not able to paradrop any supplies for the first week because all of the Army's parachutes were in one building and the building had collapsed. So they all had to be dug out from the rubble and cleaned off and repaired before they could be used. If we think about our road network, where are our potential weak points? One of them, I think, is Nijgadh Bridge. A single 2-lane bridge with very few alternatives. If this bridge goes down for some reason, you'd have to drive from Mugling over to Pokhara Butwal to connect down. Where else are there places like that? The Mugling Bridge itself, if both of these two bridges go down, and they will if the Buri Gandaki Dam fails, then East and West Nepal are separated from each other. Also, our electricity and telecom networks, they tend to have spines along southern Nepal and then these tree patterns going up into the mountains. So we have certain towers, certain junctions that are quite vulnerable. If they go down, then entire districts go down. We've seen that many times when there is a landslide that takes one electricity tower down or one telecom tower down, and 6 districts have no more connection. How do we design an infrastructure that will actually be able to withstand increasing extreme weather shocks? Also, if we think about how's our planning taking place, let's take railroad planning. We have 3 separate proposals that keep being talked about. There's a Chinese railroad coming in from Kerong to Kathmandu, potentially connecting to Pokhara and to Lumbini. There's talks of bringing the Indian Railroad to Kathmandu and along the East-West Highway. Then there's the metro rail for Kathmandu. But railroads are 100-year investments. Have we thought about what kind of network we need for Nepal in the long run? Are these 3 sufficient? How do they interface with each other? How do we connect the long-distance trains to Kathmandu's metro? How do we have trains serve commuters in growing cities such as Bhairava, Lumbini, Dharam, Biratnagar, and other places like that? What connections do we need to move freight in 100 years? How do we connect to neighboring countries? And also keep in mind that railroads are much harder to build in mountain areas in terms of grades and curvatures. And if a bridge goes down or a landslide goes across, a road can be redirected very quickly across temporary bridges or temporary roads. You cannot do that with railroads. Kathmandu Airport's terminal is running out of space, and long before Nijgadh is built, they're proposing to quickly build a new international terminal. This is a 2018 design from ADP. It would sit over where the current domestic terminal and Army hangars are, and the domestic would switch into international. Could be built fairly quickly, but while we're at it, why not also add a metro station downstairs in the new terminal instead of the current metro map, which has the station down by the airport gate, which will be almost 2 kilometers away from this? How do we integrate our infrastructure in ways that make more sense? And who is the infrastructure for in the first place? We talk a lot about 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 lane highways, but they interrupt old walking paths. Pedestrians, bicyclists, animals start walking along the sides. Going along the sides, they become dangerous to cross. Okay, the solution with the Kamandi Ring Road is building bridges across, but are they accessible to the elderly, to the handicapped? Can we think of infrastructure for them too? What makes it more inclusive? So I just raised a bunch of questions. Where do we go from here? One question is, how long do we continue building infrastructure in the 21st century that uses designs from the 20th century or even older? We spent $6 million on acquiring land and building a fence in Nijgadh. Does that mean we're committed to potentially wasting several $1 billion building an airport that might only be ready when people stop flying? I raised the questions about Nijgadh and in National Planning Commission recently, and the answer was, we're already far along. Well, how far along are we, and when's a good time to stop? Do we wait until we're at the same place as Mexico City's airport? Do we need to build a really expensive battery using 140-year-old technology to meet our peak power needs? Or are there cheaper, faster alternatives? Have they been considered adequately? Should we consider them now, even though we've already spent a lot of money in land acquisition? How do we ensure that the right questions are asked in the decision-making process? And who will ask these questions, if not IIDS Center for Sustainability? Thank you. Look forward to really lively discussion.
Okay. Thanks so much, Arnico for the presentation. I'm now going to ask Aarjan to give us a few minutes of commentary and to moderate the Q&A session.
Hi, thank you, Avdit. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Namaste, everyone. My name is Aarjan Dixit, and thanks again, Avdit and IIDS for inviting me. And thank you, Dr. Panday, for that provocative presentation where you're asking a lot of bold questions, challenging some of the underlying decisions that have been taken about sort of infrastructure development in Nepal in the face of climate and other challenges. There are lots of questions. I hope Dr. Panday will provide some of the answers during the discussions as well, but I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion later. I'll use my moderator's prerogative to maybe quickly respond in general to Dr. Panday's presentation. And I have just 3 quick points I want to make. And then I'll open it up for questions. I see there are already a few questions in the chat. Please feel free to put them in the chat or use the raise hand function in Zoom to ask your questions. So the first point I wanted to make is that there is a significant infrastructure gap and the investment need for building infrastructure in Nepal to meet sort of our economic growth aspirations are quite significant. We do need major investments in all sectors, right? Not just in these large infrastructure development, 2 examples that Dr. Panday was talking about, but across all sectors to create the kind of economic growth that's required, as well as improve well-being and meet some of our sustainable development goal targets. But it's quite critical, as was evident in Dr. Pandey's presentation as well, that we need to be seriously integrating climate change risks into these infrastructure decision-making processes. A recent IIDS report estimates that the additional cost of incorporating climate change into these investment needs is about 16% of total needs. I suspect that's a conservative estimate, and that the cost may actually be higher than that. But regardless of that, I think integrating climate risks is quite critical, and it's beyond just managing sort of the various investment risks during infrastructure development. And I think we need to be doing this integration for two primary reasons, right? So the first, so that our infrastructure, the ones that we build, are resilient to the impacts of climate change and increasing extreme events. But second, so that we also don't build infrastructure that'll lock us into a development pathway that'll increase our vulnerabilities over time. I do think that the insurance industry, for example, can play a pivotal role in helping to price and transfer some of these risks, as well as help promote some climate risk management solutions from these infrastructure asset owners, which in the case here would be maybe the Nepali state. But I do think that the private sector's role in helping sort of, while there may be a role for the private sector in helping fill our infrastructure gap, primarily through capital financing and so on, the task of resilience building and incorporating climate and environmental risks into infrastructure, I think it needs to be championed by our government, its public agencies, and by civil society in general. And my hope is that that institutions such as the National Planning Commission and the newly formed National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority in particular, sort of really build their capacities in the space and play a much stronger role in enabling the integration of climate risks across these difficult and myriad sort of decision-making processes and spaces across not just in sort of central government, but across all levels of Nepal's federal structure. The second point that I wanted to make is that though we know broadly what climate change impacts could look like across Nepal, there is still considerable uncertainty around how these impacts will manifest, particularly at the local level, where decisions about infrastructure design and infrastructure sitting need to be made. We know that temperature will increase, but however, the direction of precipitation is still unclear, and it's unclear much more so at levels where you need to make these kinds of decisions. We also expect the intensity and frequency of extreme events to increase, but we don't know yet by how much, where, and when those extreme events will happen. And as Dr. Panday was talking about earlier, the geology and the hydrology of the Himalayas, they're fragile systems, and it's not clear how these systems will respond and what kind of cascading risks we'll have to deal with as the impacts of climate change get worse. And to add to this, our level of scientific inquiry, research, climate modeling in the region is already low to start with, and it needs significant investments. So while lack of information maybe shouldn't be a barrier to action, however, these kinds of challenges do call for maybe a fundamentally different approach to infrastructure design and development. And here I'm thinking about sort of, how do we incorporate principles of quality, around flexibility, around robustness, around durability, around sort of identifying these weak points in the network that Dr. Panday was talking about, to face these potential climate change scenarios for Nepal, and ensure that we actually address some of these risks, right? And then my final point is that humanity writ large, I think we're at a serious sort of moment of reckoning with regards to climate change. But our global institutions, I'm not sure if they're really up to the mark to meet this challenge. The 26th Conference of Parties is happening in a month's time in Glasgow, and it's a critical moment to advance climate action, but it's taking place amid sort of serious concerns about travel and safety related to the pandemic, the inequality of vaccine distribution, the lack of sort of meeting commitments for climate finance has made serious sort of issues with trust, and the social demands for sort of building back better from COVID from all sections of society across the world are sort of driving governments into very, very different directions. And even if all the countries that have made their pledges under the Paris Agreement were to meet those pledges, we are still seriously close to breaching the 1.5 degree limit, which effectively can only be done if we halve global emissions by 2030. So Greta Thunberg recently calling it, the blah, 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 blah COP is perhaps a good representation of the global mood as well. And this global architecture for addressing climate change that includes countries submitting their nationally determined contributions, but then which are not subject to any sort of major international sanction or oversight or verification. It got us the global treaty in Paris in 2015, but it's yet to show that it can actually lead to the dramatic reduction in emissions that's needed to control runaway climate change. So in this context, more than ever, I think we, from a national level, I think we do need skillful leadership and innovative diplomacy to be able to deal with this challenge. And to me, that primarily means leveraging all types of global platforms and venues, while also engaging in the UNFCCC process to advance our interests and to improve the process itself for small and vulnerable countries. I'm not sure if we've been very successful in doing that. But if we really look to one of our neighbors, Bangladesh, it's a fantastic example of how they've done this in the last 10, 15 years. They've successfully, developed a voice of moral clarity for the most vulnerable in these climate negotiations. They've engaged in some pretty innovative diplomacy through helping create, this climate vulnerable forum as a negotiating group within the UNFCCC and so on. So I do think that we need to sort of expand our international diplomacy in this as well. So with that, thanks again for a wonderful presentation and a great set of PowerPoint slides, as well as the opportunity to provide these quick remarks. I think we'll start taking your questions. Dr. Panday, maybe there are a few questions in the chat already that we'll start with. Dr. Bohra is asking about, whether we have an inventory of Melamchi type at-risk communities with similar upstream sedimentation buildup. And then a follow-on question about using these kinds of events like Melamchi. Can there be a vulnerability index assessment calculations for others similarly at-risk communities? Over to you, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start with the first question about whether there isn't a full inventory. I'm not sure if it's complete yet or not, but the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Authority is very concerned about places with lots of loose sediment that used to mostly get snowfall that have started to get rainfall instead. And that the picture of that landslide I showed from Northern Gorkha is one of those places. So they are in the process of, I believe, building such an inventory, but it's not publicly available. But I've had conversations with them where they're very concerned about a large number of places. Melamchi had both the sediments higher up that came down onto Brematang and then the whole Brematang plateau itself. And I think I showed Poksundo as a possible similar situation, less sediments, but more of still having water behind the landslide dam. I don't think a centralized database exists, but the government is quite serious over the coming year to build up a national early warning alert system for all kinds of disasters And part of designing that system will, of course, involve creating a much better inventory of risks at different places.
Great, thanks. I think
the second question about, can there be a vulnerability index assessment calculation?
Yeah.
I wouldn't personally know how to do that, but I assume that one should be able to, yes.
There was a comment from Mr. Hompanta about hydrogen and biofuels being substitutes for fossil fuels for air transport, but I don't know if there's a question in that. So moving on, we have a question from Avidit, who's asking, I think this is about Nijgadh, where he's asking, if we take the environmental impact report at face value, what's the economic rationale for this project, given existing projected demands for international aviation in Nepal? What does the cost-benefit analysis look like?
So Homji's question, I guess, in theory, they could make air transport clean, but I kind of follow aviation as a hobby, and I don't see, every now and then there's a test flight that uses mostly biofuel, but what's the carbon footprint of actually producing that, and what's the cost of like producing that biofuel from where people would be producing food? Hydrogen's still a long ways away. The speed at which aviation has to come down over the coming decade or two to contain climate is much faster than the speed at which alternatives are being developed, or fossil fuels use has to come down. Avadit, your question about the economic rationale for Nijgadh Airport. It's actually not been that easy finding a lot of information about it, but I found a 50-page PowerPoint from 2018 that kind of described the whole airport, going into the history of, it was mostly projecting demand moving forward, looking at past trends, past increases in aviation, and when will we run out of space in Kathmandu, and what are the alternatives? So taking kind of a narrowly engineering defined solution, making the growth rates as the given assumption, and based on that, then figuring out, okay, by what year will we need the additional capacity? How will that keep growing? Projecting past growth into the future. I think up to 2018, that might have, if you ignore climate change, it would have been probably the best assumption of how aviation would change, and was that it will continue growing at double digits annually into the foreseeable future. COVID showed us that, wait a minute, not necessarily. There could be all kinds of shocks to it. And even over the last year and a half, the urgency of climate mitigation has really taken over the public discourse. And so my question is whether there is even a economic rationale left for the airport. I do think the new terminal in Kathmandu Airport is unavoidable and needs to be built, but perhaps aviation will not grow beyond that. Homji, your question about solar and wind can be balanced by Buri Gandaki like hydro, or pump hydro. I agree there's a need for intermittent solar and wind power to be combined with storage of energy, because when the sun shines or when the wind blows is not necessarily when people need the most electricity. Whether you store up new water in Buri Gandaki to use once, or you create a pump storage hydro in a place that uses a lot less water total, that pumps it up when there's maximum available and drops it down again, or whether you use Tesla batteries. What is the best solution? I'm not sure. Doing back of the envelope calculations, I question whether Buri Gandaki is the best way of storing electricity for peak use. Your question about what the Planning Commission is doing about solar power. Well, as you know, every time there's a change in government, the entire team at the Planning Commission gets swapped out. I've been there as an unpaid advisor in my free time for the last 1 month, and I'm still learning my way around. But I have decided that it's not too early to start asking difficult questions and to start challenging assumptions. I know that with recent inaugurations of solar power plants, it is starting to catch increasing attention, but I haven't seen much done yet at the Planning Commission. I'm there to broaden the scope of the discussion, but I'm not a member of the Planning Commission itself. Alokji, your question about logical infrastructure for rural Nepal. Gravity ropeway might work in some places for certain things. It seems like, I mean, there have been gravity ropeways in a bunch of places. I once read a study of about 6 of them or so. People seem to prefer having motor vehicles drive up to their village up on the slope. Partly also a lot of the simple gravity ropeways are only for bringing things down rather than up. To bring things up with the ropeways, you need to have some systems of weight, etc. I guess it could be done, but the preference seems to be for roads. Perhaps also because we have, as far as I know, the second largest number of JCB backhoes around Nepal in all of South Asia. And so they need work and they need contracts. And so people tend to rent them for 1,800, 2,000 rupees an hour to dig roads, or so-called roads that will at least last until the next rainfall. I think they're probably a limited solution. It's like trying to swap out all cooking with firewood with using induction cookers. Sure, it's good to switch over to electricity for clean cooking, but that's not going to cook your big pots for bhojas. It's not going to cook your animal feed outdoors. It might not heat up your water, except in small kettle. I think any solutions require looking at what the full needs are and how to make those work. I think they're part of the solution, but not a sole solution. I think there are no other questions in the chat box.
Yeah, maybe we can open it up to the audience if anybody has questions. Yes, Mr. Hompant. Sorry, sir. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so our climate change, this is something that will be given to us. त्यसबाट हुन सक्ने ड्यामेजेसहरु चाहिँ हामीले फ्याक्टर इन गर्नु पर्यो। एउटा समस्या चाहिँ के भने अब हिउँ पग्लिएपछि हाम्रो पेरिनियल रिभर्सहरु चाहिँ दे विल ड्राई आउट पोसिबली। त्यसकारण हामीलाई पानीको पनि समस्या हुन्छ, अब एनर्जीको पनि समस्या छ। त्यसकारण त्यो हुनुभन्दा अगाडि नै हामीले अलिकति व्यवस्था गर्ने हो भने चाहिँ हाम्रो जति खोज परेका ठाउँहरु छन् जहाँ भाइबल छ त्यो सबै ठाउँमा चाहिँ माथिदेखि तलसम्म सिक्वेन्स अफ ड्याम्सहरु बनाउनु चाहिँ अब पैसाले पुग्दैन त्यो अर्कै कुरा हो। त्यसो गर्यो भने चाहिँ त्यसले त्यो बाढी पनि रोक्छ, पहिरो पनि रोक्छ, अथवा त्यसको इम्प्याक्टहरु घटाउन सक्छ र हामीलाई पानी रोक्ने बर्खाको पानी चाहिँ मनसुनको बेलाको पानी रोकेर हामी मेकानिजमहरु बिल्ड हुन सक्छ। त्यसकारण हाम्रो सबै पहाडका खलसाहरु चाहिँ कुनै न कुनै प्रकारले रोक्ने स्ट्र्याटेजी चाहिँ नेपालले पर्छ कि जस्तो चाहिँ मलाई लाग्दैन। तपाईहरुको कमेन्ट
अलिकति क्लियर आएन आवाज, माइक्रोफोनको नजिक।
ओके, ठीक छ, ठीक छ। यो क्लाइमेट चेन्जको अब जुन नेगेटिभ इम्प्याक्ट छ, एडभर्स इम्प्याक्ट छ, त्यो त हाम्रो लागि गिभन हो। वी क्यान डु एनिथिङ विथ दिस, वी हेभ टु एडाप्ट। एउटा त्यसको प्रभाव चाहिँ नि अब हाम्रो हिउँ सिद्धिन्छ, हजुर, खोलाहरू सुक्छन्, अनि हामीलाई त्यो पानीको समस्या हुन्छ। त्यसकारण हाम्रा सबै खोल्साहरू, पहाडका खोल्साहरूलाई थुनेर त्यसमा चाहिँ ड्यामको सिक्वेन्स बनाउने के तलदेखि माथिसम्म। त्यस्तो स्ट्र्याटेजी लियो भने पानी पनि रोकिन्छ, बाढी पनि रोकिन्छ होला। त्यसले बोकेर थुपार्दै लगाउने चाहिने घट्छ अनि हामी एनर्जी पनि निकाल्न सक्छौँ पानी पनि वर्षाको पानी रोकेर अब त्यसलाई चाहिँ नि वर्षभरि मिलाएर प्रयोग गर्न सकिन्छ त्यसकारण त्यस्तो प्रकारको स्ट्र्याटेजीले नै अब त्यो अलि बढी क्यापिटल इन्टेन्सिभ हुन सक्छ तर अब त्यो प्रकारको सोचाइ राख्ने हो कि भन्ने मेरो चाहिँ नि कुरा भयो तपाईहरुको कमेन्ट के छ यसमा
हजुर अब यसो छ कुनै ठाउँमा त्यो चाहिने चाहिँ पक्का हो अब भ्रमणथाङबाट हाम्रो मेलम्ची ड्रिङ्किङ वाटर प्रोटेक्ट गर्न हाम्रो चाहिँ कति ठाउँमा चाहिँ अब चेक ड्यामहरू चाहिने हुन्छ माथि कहाँसम्म चाहिँ सेडिमेन्टलाई आउन दिने कसरी रोक्ने कहाँनिर रोक्ने भन्ने अब त्यो स्टडी चाहिँ भइरहेछन् त्यो चाहिने हो अब तपाईँको सबै खोलाहरू थुन्नु पर्छ भन्नेमा चाहिँ अलिकति कुनै ठाउँमा चाहिने र सबै चाहिनेमा चाहिँ बिचमा ठुलै ग्याप छ र कुन ठाउँमा चाहिन्छ भनेर अध्ययन गरेर मात्रै गर्दा राम्रो होला अब सबै कुनेर रोकेर त्यसको चाहिँ अब साइड इम्प्याक्टहरू के हुन सक्छन् भन्ने पनि हुन सक्ला तर मलाई लागेको चाहिँ हामीलाई अध्ययन बढी चाहिरहेको छ कता रिस्क छन् कता के गर्नुपर्छ कहाँ के गर्दाखेरि फाइदा हुन्छ कुन ठाउँमा हामीलाई के चाहिएको छ भनेर
त्यो पक्का त्यो स्टडी गर्नुपर्छ तर स्ट्र्याटेजी चाहिँ के भने हामीले अलि रिजर्भयर सिस्टममा जाने कुरा बढाउनु पर्छ घटाउने हैन बढाउनु पर्छ भन्ने खालको
रेजर्भर पुगेको छैन नेपालमा त्यो चाहिँ पक्का हो तर रेजर्भर नपुग्दैमा हामीले चाहिँ एकैपल्ट $3 अरब खर्च गरेर एउटा ठुलो ड्याममा बनाएर सबै पैसा त्यसमा खन्याउँदा अप्टिमल हो कि होइन भन्ने प्रश्न उठाएको मैले
त्यो ठिक छ त्यो यो कुरा चाहिँ के तपाईले उठाएको कुरा ठिक छ तिनीहरुलाई राम्रोसँग खेलाउनु पर्छ तर त्यसको सल्युसन चाहिँ नि हामीले बेटर टेक्नोलोजी चाहिँ कसरी ल्याउने भन्ने कुरा हो वी क्यान नट रन अवे फ्रम दिस प्रब्लम it's given to us. It was a nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. There's another question in the chat box, Dr. Panday. This is from Mr. Manjit Raj Panday. What's the influence of geopolitics on planning and design of climate-sensitive infrastructure for Nepal? For example, the reservoir-type hydroelectric plants and river linking projects around Nepal is mostly in line with National River Linking Project of India. Though these projects have socioeconomic benefits, but climate impacts have largely been neglected. How can people like yourselves who are in government policy bodies start such discussions?
I'm actually not sure whether the Buri Gandaki is part of the larger vision by India for the river linking project. The Koshi High Dam and Karnali High Dam, and those are like right where the rivers exit onto the foothills. That's what I think India would like to see. I feel like whether the projects benefit India or Nepal, we need to have much better analysis of both the risks and as well as the impact on climate as well as on people, and on who is being served and who's suffering for it. If you read Ramesh Bhusal's article in the third poll on Buri Gandaki, the 50,000 people who are being displaced from there feel they're being extremely unfairly treated because they're getting government compensation that is far below market rate for what they own, what is expected to get flooded. How can people like me start such discussions? I think by daring to speak out, which is what I'm doing. And I put time into putting this presentation together, not just to show it once here, but to keep pushing certain issues. And by asking questions, I think trained as a scientist, I believe it's really important that we ask questions and we look for complete answers rather than pretending to know the solution right away for everything. And so part of my approach is just to keep asking questions and to figure out whether the right questions are asked at the right time or
not. Thanks. There's a raised hand. Maybe we can take that question first, Mr. DP Adhikari.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Panday, for delivering a kind of a thought-provoking lecture. So many interesting topics. Very interesting. but in Nepalese context, we talk a lot, but we do very little. It's the reality, and the most missing part in our context is doing research. No priority for research. And you talked about Melamchi disaster, and it was the national pride project. But looking back, the history and seeing the present disaster, the research was not done, even just a few hundred meters upstream from the intake. Therefore, what I think is it's just the wake-up call for Nepal in the context of climate change. Not only the climate change, but the geological hazard. We are in the seismic risk zone that is completely ignored, and the very big issue in our case is research net. Nothing is studied, and the other big projects, big or small projects of planning in the future should have thorough study, and the National Planning Commission should empathize all these things, I suppose. अब त्यसकारण अलिकति यसलाई अलिकति भन्न चाहेको कुरा, यहाँले त्यो जुन कुरा गर्नुभयो मेलम्चीकै कुरा नि, अझै कम्प्लिट अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङ छैन। रिसर्च नेपालमा जियोलोजिस्ट छन्, नेपालमा क्लाइमेटसँग रिलेटेड स्टडी गर्ने मानिसहरू छन्, काम गरिरहेका छन्, तर रिसर्च गर्ने यिनै विषयवस्तुमा पनि सरकारको तर्फबाट कुनै प्रायोरिटी छैन, कुनै फन्डिङ छैन, कुनै सुविधाहरू छैन। त्यसकारणले भविष्यको लागि सोचेर पनि अलिकति नेशनल प्लानिङ कमिसनले यी कुराहरूमा राम्रोसँग उठान गरिदिनु भयो भने देशको लागि अलिकति कल्याण हुन्थ्यो कि जस्तो कता कता त्यो लाग्छ। अब यो हाई ड्यामका कुरा र साथीहरूले हाम्रो पन्त सरले कसले भन्नुभयो प्रत्येक खोलालाई थुन्ने, रिजर्भर बनाउने, पानी जम्मा गर्ने आदि इत्यादि। अब ती कुरा जियोलोजिकल पोइन्ट अफ भ्यूबाट पनि अब कतिको प्र्याक्टिकेबल छ ती कुराहरू हेर्न जरुरी होला। त्यसकारणले समग्रमा यहाँले धेरै विषयवस्तुहरूको उठान गर्नुभयो। अब त्यो उठानमा यहाँले राख्नु भएको क्वेशनमा आर वी ट्राभलिङ स्ट्रेट वाइल द रोड अहेड कर्भ्स भन्दा यस हामी चाहिँ एकदम स्ट्रेट ट्राभल गर्न खोज्छौँ। रोड अहेड यहाँले पोइन्ट आउट गर्नुभयो जस्तै एकदमै बाङ्गोटिङ्गो बाटो छ। त्यो बाङ्गोटिङ्गो बाटोमा अगाडि बढ्ने तयारी नेपालको कन्टेक्स्टमा ठ्याक्कै छँदै नै छैन। त्यस कारणले यसको तयारी हुनुपर्छ जस्तो लाग्छ। हस्, धेरै धन्यवाद।
हजुर, थ्याङ्क यू। अब असै प्रश्न उठाउनु भएन। अब सबै कुरामा म एकदमै सहमत गर्छु। अब कसरी यो परिवर्तन ल्याउनेतिर हेर्ने हो। हजुर, अजयजीले त यो विषयमा गुरु नै हुनुहुन्छ। अब हजुर,
गुरु त होइन, मैले एउटा प्रोफेसर रिटायर हुँदै रहेछ होइन, अनि विद्यार्थीहरूले हो तँ त कस्तो जान्दछस् भनेछन्, अनि प्रोफेसरले होइन एउटै कुरो 30 वर्ष दोहोऱ्याएको भने जस्तो तपाईँको प्रेजेन्टेसन सुन्दाखेरि तपाईँसित टेलिफोनमा कुरा गरेर त्यो तपाईँको जस्तो पावर पोइन्ट कसरी बनाउने एकपल्ट चाहिँ नि कोचिङ चाहिँ दिनु पर्ला है। एब्सोल्युटली फ्यासिनेटिङ द वे यु मेड द पावर पोइन्ट। दुई चारवटा कुरा मैले यसो आफ्नो एउटा विगत 40 वर्ष यी विषयमा काम गरेकोमा केही सेयर गर्न मन लाग्यो। अर्निकोजीले एकदम त्यो ठुल्ठुलो कुराहरूको गर्नुभयो। म एकदम माइक्रो लेभलमा जान थालेँ कि। अब माइक्रो लेभलमा जान थाल्दा सेडिमेन्टको कुरा गर्नुभयो। मैले 1981मा सेडिमेन्टमै मैले मास्टर्स गरेर फर्केँ, अनि मलाई लाग्दथ्यो यो सेडिमेन्टेसन नै यो संसारको सबैभन्दा ठुलो समस्या हो, अनि म त्यसमा काम गर्न थालेँ। मैले के पाएँ भनेदेखि खास गरी साउथ एसियामा पानीको डिस्कसनमा सेडिमेन्ट इज समथिङ द्याट नोबडी वान्ट्स। सबैलाई चाहिँ ब्लू वाटर चाहिएको छ, सेडिमेन्ट कसैलाई पनि चाहिएको छैन। त्यो हाम्रो प्रायोरिटीमा, हाम्रो अन्डरस्ट्यान्डिङमा, रिसर्चमा पर्दैन। नेपाल सरकारले अहिले 20 वटा स्टेसनमा चाहिँ नि सेडिमेन्ट मोनिटर गर्छ त्यो डेटा पनि 2005-06 सम्म मात्र एभाइलेबल छ त्यसपछिको डेटा पनि एभाइलेबल छैन त्यो कसैले मोनिटर गर्दैन सेडिमेन्टको वास्तविकता त्यो हो एनडीआरएम ले जेसुकै भने पनि द्याट्स नम्बर 1 नम्बर 2 बुढी गण्डकी प्रोजेक्ट इज अ प्रोजेक्ट इन गण्डकी बेसिन त्यसबाट आएको ड्याम बनाएपछि आएको रेगुलेटेड पानी त्रिशुली हुँदै त्यसपछि गएर हाम्रो त्रिशुली हुँदै चाहिँ नि गण्डक ब्याराजमा पुग्दछ र गण्डक ब्याराजबाट इन्डियाले बनाउने जुन रिभर लिङ्किङ प्रोजेक्ट हो रेगुलेटेड पानीको बेनिफिट त्यहाँ पनि पुग्दछ यो त्रिशुली प्रोजेक्टको रेगुलेटेड वाटरको बारेमा थुप्रो कुराहरू लेखिया छ मैले पनि लेखेको छु त्यसपछि गएर सोशल कस्टको बारेमा खास गरी यो नेपालमा भएका लार्ज स्केल इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चरको सोशल कस्टको बारेमा मैले पनि सुरुमा धेरै नै काम गरेँ तर अब अहिले यो गुगल आएपछि कस्तो भयो भनेदेखि नि हामी बुढाहरूले गरेको चाहिने कुराहरू जम्मै अब ओझेलमा छ कि कसैले त्यसलाई सम्झेन हामीले ब्रान्डिङ पनि गर्न सकेनौँ त्यो नम्बर 2 त्यसपछि नम्बर 3 अब यो इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चरको कुरा एउटा वर्षमा 18 वटा ब्रिज भत्किने भन्ने पनि हुन्छ भन्नुस् त कुनै पनि मुलुकको एउटा वर्षमा एउटा बर्खामा 18 वटा ब्रिज चाहिँ नि इट गेट्स ड्यामेज नाउ द्याट ड्यामेज इज precisely because the design is poor, the construction quality is poor. त्यसको चाहिँ इन्जिनियरिङ इथोसहरू चाहिँ नि मेन्टेन भएको छैन इन्जिनियरिङ क्वालिटी मेन्टेन भएको छैन that is much more important than perhaps the the physical aspect of the changing flow यो त्यसको त्यसपछि गएर अर्को मलाई के लाग्यो भने इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चरको कुरा गर्दा हामीले अब बुढी गण्डकीको कुरा गर्यौँ मेलम्चीको कुरा गर्यौँ लास्ट इयर मैले यो नेपालमा यसपालिको होइन लास्ट इयर पनि यस्तै ठुलो बमन्डर ल्यान्डस्लाइड भएको थियो 35 वटा जिल्लामा यस्तै ल्यान्डस्लाइड भएको थियो त्यसको मैले एउटा अध्ययन गरेको थिएँ त्यो अध्ययनमा हामीले के पायौँ भनेदेखि 35 वटा जिल्लामा 337 वटा ल्यान्डस्लाइड हामीले हेर्दा 61% ल्यान्डस्लाइड नयाँ बाटोको छेउमा पायौँ हैन यो नन इन्जिनियर्ड रोडको हामीले छेउमा पायौँ अनि त्यहाँ चाहिँ नि यो 2016-17 मा 12,000 हाई यो हेभी इक्विपमेन्टहरू इम्पोर्ट भएको डेटा छ हामीले यो पोलिटिकल इकोनोमीलाई बिर्सेर त अगाडि जानै सक्दैनौँ हामी नेपालमा डोजरे विकासको डोजर बाटोको त्यो पोलिटिकल इकोनोमीमा कसरी चाहिँ नि इलेक्टेड हाम्रा यी प्रतिनिधिहरू छन् कसरी त्यो चाहिँ प्ले आउट भइरहेको छ यो चाहिँ नि इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चरको कुरो गर्दाखेरि त्यसको कुरो रोपवेको कुरा गर्नुभयो रोपवेको बारेमा मैले अलग डाक्टर साहबलाई चाहिँ हामीले एउटा पुस्तक लेखेका छौँ रोपवेज इन नेपाल भनेर 2003 मा आयो यो रोपवेले नेपालको बाटोको पोलिटिकल इकोनोमिक्ससित हार्यो सकेन ट्रान्सपोर्टेसनमा टुरिज्ममा अहिले छन् जस्तो चाहिँ नि मनोकामनामा छ त्यसपछि चन्द्रगिरीमा छ त्यसपछि गएर कालिम्पोङमा छ अरू ठाउँमा टुरिज्मको लागि प्रस्तावित छन् तर ट्रान्सपोर्टेसनको हिसाबबाट एक दुई ठाउँमा त्यो ग्राभिटी रोपवे छ अरू रोपवे चाहिँ छैन अर्को मैले देख्दा एउटा अन्त्यमा के भन्न चाहन्छु भनेदेखि यो इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चरको कुरा गर्दा इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज गाइडेड मोर बाई इन्भेस्टमेन्ट अघि आर्जनले इन्भेस्टमेन्ट होइन हामीलाई यदि इन्भेस्टमेन्ट चाहियो हाम्रो इन्भेस्टमेन्ट ग्याप छ हाम्रो इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चर ग्याप छ विच इज फाइन हामीलाई बाटो पनि चाहिन्छ हामीलाई वाटर सप्लाई प्रोजेक्ट्सहरू पनि चाहिन्छ तर मैले कहाँ ग्याप देख्छु भनेदेखि त्यो इन्भेस्टमेन्टको प्लानिङहरूमा क्लाइमेटको कुरा रिस्कको कुरा यी बेसिक अरू नलेजको कुराहरू ल्याएर त्यसलाई इन्टरडिसिप्लिनारिटीको एउटा एलिमेन्ट ल्याउने चाहिँ नि देयर इज भेरी भेरी साइलोड अप्रोच टु हाउ वी कन्सिभ डेभलपमेन्ट होइन नलेजको स्तरमा निकै धेरै हामीले काम गर्नु छ अघि हाम्रो अधिकारी डिपी सरले पनि भन्नुभयो यति मैले आफ्नो एउटा यसो अनुभव चाहिँ नि सेयर गर्नु छ
हजुर थ्याङ्क यू अजयजीले बोल्नुभयो कि नयाँ कुरा सिक्नु पाइन्छ हजुरको लेखहरू पनि पहिला धेरै पढेको चाहिँ थिएँ अहिले चाहिँ गुगल सर्च गरेर जहाँबाट अलिकति इमेजहरू भेट्टाइन्छ अनि आजकल न्युज मिडियाहरूमा पनि युट्युबको स्क्रिनसटहरू पनि एकदमै इन्ट्रेस्टिङ चाहिँ इमेजहरू पाइन्छ अब त्यो यस्तो टाउकोमा बनेको न्यारेटिभलाई अब त्यसलाई देखाउने खालको फोटोहरू खोजेर
अनि जस्तो मेलम्चीकै हेर्नुभयो भने नि 90s मा देयर हेभ बीन ह्युज डिबेट अन मेलम्ची अबाउट द रिस्क अफ द्याट प्रोजेक्ट हो त्यसमा अब हामी पनि अलिअलि सहभागी थियौँ अहिलेको यो क्याटास्ट्रोफी चाहिँ सायद त्यो बेलामा इन्भिजन भएन तर त्यो होल प्रोजेक्ट कन्सेप्चुलाइजेसन द रिस्क द्याट इन्टेल्स दोज आर काइन्ड अफ क्वेसन्स त्यो रेज चाहिँ नगरेको चाहिँ होइन तपाईँले अनकम्फर्टेबल क्वेसन भन्नुभयो नि नेपालमा 1990 पछि there were a lot of uncomfortable questions that were raised. In fact, uncomfortable question raise गर्नेहरूलाई चाहिँ त एकदमै बेकुफहरू हुन् भन्ने खालको पनि एक खालको पोलिटिकल माहौल चाहिँ बन्यो हैन। अप्ठ्यारो क्वेशन सोध्दै नसोध्ने, पोलिटिकली जे करेक्ट छ त्यही मात्र बोल्ने, अप्ठ्यारो क्वेशन नसोध्ने, त्यो खालको स्थिति पनि भएको हुनाले पर्याप्स अब धेरै पछाडि पनि नजाउँ। 1990 पछिका विकासे विवादहरूको रिस्कहरूको बारेमा जे हाम्रो त्यो 1990 को पोलिटिकल चेन्ज ल्याएको एउटा खुलापन थियो नि, त्यसलाई एकपल्ट सायद अब हाम्रो अविदित हुनुहुन्छ यङ्गर जेनेरेसनका स्कलर्सहरूले त्यसलाई चाहिँ अलिकति वस्तुपरक हिसाबले अब्जेक्टिभ हिसाबले हेरिदियो भनेदेखि एकदम राम्रो हुन्थ्यो। यति मात्र भन्नु चाहे मैले। थ्याङ्क यू।
मलाई बोल्न दिनुहुन्छ?
ओ जयराज सर, अफ कोर्स।
के अरे एउटा बच्चाको जस्तो क्वेसन अथवा कमेन्ट मेरो, अलिकति त अजयजीले छुइहाल्नुभयो केबल कारको कुरा। के अरे नेपालमा अब अहिले नै कतिपय बिजुली इलेक्ट्रिसिटी खेर जानु पनि थालेको छ। अघि उहाँले भन्नुभयो के अरे अब अर्निको पाण्डेले त्यो तामाकोसीको बिजुली चाहिँ नै अहिले खेर जान थालिरहेको छ। त्यसैले नेपाललाई एउटा बिजुली प्रयोग गर्ने, एनर्जी प्रयोग गर्ने देशको रूपमा विकसित गर्न अब रोडहरू खन्ने कामले सेडिमेन्टेसन, यो पहिरो पनि बढिरहेछ। त्यसो भएर केबल कारलाई के अरे एउटा क्रुसेडकै रूपमा, नेसनल उसकै रूपमा अगाडि बढाउने। दोस्रो चाहिँ हेलिप्याडहरू, के अरे कमसेकम 5 देखि 10 हजार हेलिप्याडहरू नेपालका हरेक डाँडामा, हरेक ठाउँमा, हरेक गाउँमा किन नबनाउने? मैले त यो आर्मीको सङ्ख्या बढेपछि, खास गरेर यो माओवादी युद्धको टाइममा हाम्रो आर्मीको सङ्ख्या डबल गराइयो। कतिको चाहिँ नि प्रयोग भइरहेको छ त्यो युवाहरूको, आर्मीमा भएको युवाहरूको मलाई थाहा छैन। यो सुरक्षाको दृष्टिले पनि र चाहिँ नि सुविधाको दृष्टिले पनि हेलिप्याडहरू बनाउने र अब अहिले टेस्लाले फुल चार्ज गरेपछि कमसेकम 300 माइलसम्म जान सक्ने गाडी त बनाइसकेका छ भने मलाई लाग्छ त्यसरी नै इलेक्ट्रिकल्ली चार्ज गरेको हेलिकप्टरहरू अब बन्ने युग पनि आउला। नभए हाम्रो इन्जिनियरिङ क्याम्पसहरूले युवा पिँढीको विद्यार्थीहरूलाई त्यतातर्फ गर, मतलब अनुसन्धान गर, प्रयोग गर र सधैँ विदेशीबाट किनेको हेलिकप्टरै युज गर्नुपर्छ भन्ने के छ? हाम्रै युवा बुद्धि के अरे भएका चाहिँ इन्जिनियरहरूले पनि त्यस्तो बनाउँछन् कि मैले सुनेको के अरे हाम्रो इन्जिनियरिङ क्याम्पसको भाइहरूले एउटा सानो प्लेन पनि बनाएका थिए। सरकारले एक्सपेरिमेन्टको रूपमा उडाउन काठमाडौँमा दिएन र फेरि त्यसलाई डिसमेन्टल गरेर पोखरा लगेर ट्राई गर्दा उड्यो भनेर भन्दै थिए। त्यसैले यो अलिकति आउट अफ द बक्स गएर सोचेर अब सानो सानो हेलिकप्टरहरू चाहिँ नि हामीले यही नै प्रड्युस गर्न सक्ने र त्यसलाई चाहिँ नि म्यासिभ स्केलमा युज गर्ने हो भनेदेखि अब अहिले अब सुत्केरी हुन लागेर अप्ठ्यारो भएको महिलाहरूलाई चाहिँ नि सेनाको हेलिकप्टर गएर, कति प्राइभेट हेलिकप्टरहरू गएर पनि ल्याएर अब रेस्क्यु गरेको चाहिँ नि ल्याएको सुनिन्छ। अब त्यो त थोरै पर्सेन्ट मात्रै होला, कति त मरेकै छन् बिचरा। तर यो दिशातिर पनि सोच्ने हो कि मेरो खाली क्वेसन मात्रै।
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. We're almost out of time, but I think there was a raised hand from Dr. Bora, so maybe we can end with that. There's also a few questions in the chat, so maybe Dr. Panday, you could respond to them over chat, but over to you, Dr. Bora. Thank you.
Dr. Panday, because you are in the position at the Planning Commission, so I thought of one idea that you might kind of consider. Over the last 40, 50 years, we've been told Nepal has the hydropower potential next to Brazil. After that, then came the micro hydro, and I think there are thousands of them. And now we're talking about solar. And of course, all those things shifting, and hopefully government and the private sector will do things. But one area that you might want to consider is we had done one case study in Bahnipati,
how about creating some sort of market structure to cope such shocks, right? For example, your landslides and flooding and all these things. Why not think about some sort of insurance mechanism, right? So that at least that kind of a market, I'm not saying 100% solution. Government has to do what it has to do. All the idea that you have laid out in terms of infrastructure, landslides and all that, that's great. But what do you think of creating some sort of insurance mechanism for the people so they can buy into? We had done one experiment design in Baunipati, asking people to, we did some non-market valuation, willingness to pay for the REN indexed insurance mechanism that they had done in Gujarat. So we wanted to try that in Baunipati. And I think there's a desire and willingness to adopt certain solutions. So any thought on that?
Sounds like an interesting idea. I don't know enough about it to comment on it. In some ways at the moment, there's a lot of risks that people face that they're either completely uninsured for, or to some extent, the government is the one stepping in at the last minute with a little bit of relief. And so the tax money is partially paying for some slight insurance coverage in disasters. I think Aarjan in his earlier opening commentary talked about the uncertainties about where, how much. In my talk, I didn't focus so much on, I said there will be more landslides, more floods, but we don't know how much, when, where. And so not having a better understanding of how to quantify the risks actually might make it difficult for the private sector to get involved in designing insurance schemes. But this is not something I know much about.
I think I'll make a final point on that, Dr. Panday, is that I think it's, like a relief effort is done everywhere in the world, right? You got some disaster, you just drop this, drop that, of course there. But I think if you put a little bit of onus on the people themselves, right? So I think that sort of a market mechanism might solve some of that risk-taking behavior. So if somebody wants to build a house right next to the river on the brink, well, they're taking the risk of being at that point. So I think this kind of same thing with forest fire, right? So having a risk internalizing by the community or the individual might, I'm not saying solve 100%, might address some of that issues. So that's my final comment.
It works if there is sufficient knowledge about the risks. In Melamchi, if you look at the broader map, yes, there's part of the bazaar that got flooded. Looks like it was floodplains long ago, but in people's living memory, the river never was that high up. And so where does the knowledge come from about the future risks compared to the past? And how do you make rational decision making? Anyway, I think our moderator would like to wrap things up. Shall I hand over to Aarjan? It's been a pleasure interacting with all of you. This has been a fun evening of presentations.
Yes, Dr. Panday, thank you so much for that great presentations. Lots of questions, lots of food for thought. Hopefully, we will be able to get to some of those answers. But thank you, everybody, for participating. Over to you to close. Thanks.
Okay, we're already about 10 minutes over time. It's a testament to how lively the discussion was and how interested people are in the topic. But I just wanted to thank again our presenter, Dr. Arnico Panday, and moderator Aarjan Dixit for today's event. Okay, thanks everybody. See you next month.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'll stay back a little bit longer if anyone wants to have more discussions.